At the farmer's market, an old man handed me a flyer and asked, "Have you seen my golden retriever?" My heart broke. "No, but I can help look if you want." His eyes were all puffy, like he'd been crying for hours. Suddenly, I felt someone sneak up behind me. Before I could react, a tiny pair of hands were grabbing my throat and choking me. The old man took off running, still crying but booking it down the street, yelling, "No, no, no, no!" I shoved the stranger off of me and spun around, gasping. It was a 12-year-old kid in a Boy Scout uniform, just standing there shaking. My throat felt like I'd swallowed glass. People were staring. Some lady was filming. I was about to grab her phone when suddenly a flood of police cars surrounded us. My heart dropped. I knew how bad it looked. A 14-year-old hitting a Boy Scout for no reason. I immediately went into defense mode. "Officer, he attacked me. I was just defending myself." The cops got out and started high-fiving each other, actually celebrating. One grabbed the Boy Scout's shoulder. "Good job, son. You did great. That kid tried to kill me." My voice came out all raspy. "We know. You're very brave." The cop was smiling. "The man who was just here, did you see which way he went?" Another cop cut in. "Yeah, he ran that way, but listen, his dog is missing. We need to find him immediately. Get in the car." To help look for the dog? They didn't answer. Just opened the back door and waited. I got in because what else was I supposed to do? The kid who choked me was in another cop car. Not handcuffed. Just sitting there calm like this was routine. We drove 30 miles over the speed limit. The cop kept asking weird questions like I was in trouble for trying to help an old man. "How long were you talking to him?" "Like 30 seconds. He just asked about his dog." "Do you always talk to strangers at markets?" At this point, the officers were ticking me off. Like, no wonder everyone thinks they're just fat donut eaters. "Can we please just focus on getting the dog back?" Every officer turned around to glare at me like I was the crazy one. Every minute we wasted was another minute his dog was out there scared. Maybe hurt. Traffic was getting heavier. What if he ran into the street? "Is that kid in trouble?" The scout? "No, but he assaulted me. You should be grateful." By this point, we'd been driving for 10 minutes. Way too long to be looking for a man who'd just run away on foot. Where are we going? To find him. The man or the dog? No answer. There. I spotted him 3 blocks from the McDonald's. Still crying. The cops surrounded him with their cars. Got out wearing thick gloves. They pulled little bottles from his pockets. He kept saying, "It's just eye drops." Over and over. At the station, everything came out. They put me in this tiny room. "I need to show you something," the detective said, and she turned the screen toward me. Security footage from the farmer's market from earlier that day. The footage started when I was talking to the crying man about his dog. She hit pause. "Watch his left hand when you're talking." I watched. His hand went to his pocket while I was describing where the dog park was. His fingers moved around in there like he was feeling for something. See how his hand went to his pocket? He was getting ready to offer you something. Kai, the Boy Scout who saved your life, recognized that move. She pulled up another video. Different farmer's market, but I recognized the setup. There was the same man. Same story about Buddy. The kid he was talking to looked about 11. Watch what happens at the 2-minute mark. The man's hand went to the same pocket. This time he pulled out something wrapped in a napkin, handed it to the kid who unwrapped it and took a bite. It looked like a cookie. He took a bite, and they started walking together toward the parking lot. The kid was stumbling by the time they reached the edge of the camera's view, like the cookie made him drunk or something. The boy is Kai from 3 weeks ago. My stomach dropped. Is he okay? He still doesn't remember what happened in the following 4 hours. He woke up in the woods with rope burns on his wrists and scratches all down his arms. She clicked through photos on her phone. The marks on his wrists looked deep. He's been going to markets every weekend since then to help us look for him. "One more thing," the detective says. "Check your pocket." I reach in and pull out a dog collar. Red, with a tag that says, Buddy. "You don't remember him giving you that?" My hands start shaking. I couldn't stop looking at the collar while my hands kept shaking harder and harder. The detective leaned forward and asked if I needed water or wanted to call my mom, but my throat felt like I'd been eating sand for hours. The words came out in this scratchy whisper when I told her I wanted my mom there right now. She left the room and made the call while I sat there holding that red collar with the metal tag that said, Buddy. 20 minutes felt like 20 hours before Mom finally rushed through the door with her face completely white, like all the blood had drained out. She grabbed me so tight I could barely breathe, and that's when I started crying for real. Not just the scared tears from before, but actual sobbing into her shoulder. The detective came back in and started explaining everything to Mom while I just sat there feeling completely numb. She turned her computer screen toward us and showed the security footage of me talking to the crying man at the farmer's market. Mom's hand found mine and squeezed, so hard it hurt when she saw his hand going to his pocket, right when he would have offered me that cookie. The detective pulled out all these forms about evidence collection and victim services that we had to sign. Mom's hands were shaking worse than mine as she tried to write her name on all the different papers. The detective told us I'd need to come back tomorrow for a full statement once I'd had time to rest and process everything. We walked out to the car, and Mom kept looking over at me every few seconds, like she was checking I was still there. She asked if I was hungry, but my stomach felt like it was tied in knots, and food was the last thing I wanted. The whole drive home, she kept reaching over to touch my shoulder or my arm, like she needed to make sure I was real. At home, I went straight to my room and locked the door behind me because I needed to be alone for a minute. I dumped everything from all my pockets onto my bed, checking every single thing, because what if he'd given me something else I didn't remember? There was just my phone, some gum wrappers, $3 in crumpled bills, and a receipt from the taco place, but I checked everything twice anyway. That night, I kept jumping at every single sound outside my window, every car door, every dog barking down the street. My brain kept replaying that moment when his hand went to his pocket over and over like a broken video. Around 3 in the morning, I finally passed out, but then I had this awful dream where I was in the woods with rope around my wrists, just like what happened to Kai. I woke up sweating and gasping and couldn't go back to sleep after that. The next morning, I heard Mom on the phone with the school telling them I wouldn't be coming in today, or probably tomorrow either. She'd already taken the day off work and was in the kitchen making pancakes and eggs like this was some normal Saturday, but I could see her eyes were all red and puffy from crying. My phone buzzed with a text from Tyler asking where I was and why I wasn't in first period. I stared at the message for like 5 minutes trying to figure out what to say, because how do you explain that you almost got kidnapped by some sick freak at the farmer's market? I just texted back that I was sick and would explain later which felt wrong. But what else could I say? Mom drove me back to the station after breakfast, even though I barely ate anything. The detective met us in the lobby and took us to a bigger room this time with a long table and better chairs. She introduced me to this guy in a suit named Carson Matthews, who worked for the district attorney's office. He shook my hand, all formal and serious, then sat down with this thick folder full of papers. He explained they were building a really strong case against the man, but they needed my detailed statement about everything I could remember from yesterday. I started telling them everything from the beginning while Carson wrote notes on this yellow legal pad. The man had been crying so hard, his whole face was wet and red and puffy when he first walked up to me. He kept wiping his nose with the back of his hand, and his voice was all shaky when he asked about his dog. I remembered how his left hand kept going to his jacket pocket while we talked, and how his fingers moved around in there. Carson asked me exactly what words the man used, and I tried to remember, but it was hard because everything happened so fast. The detective reached under the table and pulled out this clear plastic bag with the red collar inside. There was a white label stuck to the bag with numbers written in black marker, and she explained they would test it for fingerprints and any drug stuff that might have gotten on it. The collar looked smaller in the bag than it felt in my pocket, and the metal tag that said Buddy was facing up, so you could read it clearly. Carson kept asking me to go back over the timing, and I had to think really hard about how long we actually talked before the Boy Scout grabbed me. Then out of nowhere, I remembered this weird smell from when the man was standing close to me. His jacket smelled like medicine mixed with something sweet, like vanilla or sugar cookies, and it was really strong. The detective wrote that down fast and said other kids who talked to him mentioned that same exact smell. She turned her computer screen toward us again and pulled up more security videos from 2 different farmers markets in other towns. In the first one, the same man was talking to this girl who looked about my age, and you could see him crying and pointing around like he was looking for something. His hand went to that same pocket, right when the girl was shaking her head no. The second video showed him with a younger boy, and this time he actually pulled something wrapped in a napkin from his pocket, but the kid's mom showed up and grabbed her son before anything else happened. Carson closed his folder and looked at Mom and me with this serious expression on his face. He told us I couldn't help with any police stuff from now on, because they needed to keep me safe and make sure I could testify without any problems. Mom nodded and grabbed my hand under the table, and I could feel her shaking a little bit. We left the station around noon, and Mom was quiet the whole drive home, but I could see her knuckles turning white from gripping the steering wheel so hard. As soon as we got inside, she started making all these new rules about how I couldn't go anywhere by myself anymore. She needed to know exactly where I was every second of the day, and there was no way I was ever going to another farmer's market. I understood why she was scared, but it still made me feel trapped in my own house. She made me give her Tyler's number and his mom's number and said she would be calling to check on me if I went over there. That night, Mom's phone buzzed with an email from the detective, and she showed me the screen. It was this official paper showing the collar had been sent to the state crime lab for testing. The paper had 6 different signatures at the bottom and timestamps showing exactly when each person handled the evidence. Mom saved the email to a special folder on her phone that she labeled with the case number the detective gave us. The next morning, I went to the school like normal, but during first period, the office aide came to get me. Rowan Schneider was waiting in the counseling office with this concerned look on his face. He said the principal wanted to make sure I had support after what happened and suggested we should meet twice a week to talk about how I was doing. I didn't really want to talk to the school counselor, but Mom had already agreed to it, so I didn't have a choice. Rowan gave me this worksheet about identifying feelings and a hall pass that let me leave class if I needed to talk to someone. 2 days later, Mom got a call from the detective while we were eating dinner, and I could only hear Mom's side of the conversation. She kept saying things like, "Oh my God, and are you serious?" while looking at me with huge eyes. When she hung up, she told me they searched the man's house and found 17 more dog collars in a box in his closet. Every single collar had a tag that said Buddy, but they were all different colors and sizes, like he bought them from different stores. The detective said this proved he had been doing this for a really long time, and there were probably more kids out there who never reported what happened. Mom's phone started ringing again that night, and when she looked at the screen, she got this angry look on her face. Whitney Solis from the local news had left 3 voicemails asking if we would do an interview about what everyone was calling the Boy Scout hero story. Mom deleted every single message without even listening to the whole thing and told me if any reporters tried to talk to me at the school, I should go straight to the office. She said we weren't talking to any news people no matter what, because this was hard enough without everyone in town knowing our business. 3 days later, Carson called and said we needed to meet at his office downtown to go over what was coming next. Mom drove us there after lunch, and we sat in this conference room with a long wooden table while Carson pulled out a thick folder full of papers. He spread them out and started explaining how the whole legal thing would work, pointing at different forms and timelines while Mom took notes on everything. He looked right at me and said the defense lawyer would try to make it seem like the man was just a confused old guy who lost his dog, and that I was making a bigger deal out of this than it really was. Mom's face got red, and she started to argue, but Carson held up his hand and explained this was just what defense lawyers do, trying to create doubt so their client gets a lighter sentence, or maybe even walks free. The next morning, Mom drove me to see Adeline Crow at this office building near the hospital. Adeline had short gray hair and this calm voice that made me feel less nervous right away. She had me sit in this big chair and taught me this breathing thing where you count to 4 breathing in, hold for 4, then breathe out for 4. We practiced it over and over until I could do it without thinking about it. She said whenever I started feeling that panic feeling coming on, I should do the breathing, and it would help my body calm down. She gave me this worksheet to track when I felt scared and what was happening right before it started. 2 days after that, Mom decided we needed to go back to the farmer's market because running away from our fears wasn't healthy. I told her I wasn't ready, but she said we'd just walk through real quick to get some tomatoes and lettuce. The parking lot was packed like always, and I could already feel my chest getting tight. We got out of the car and started walking toward the entrance, but the second I saw the first row of vendor tents, my breathing got all messed up. My hands started shaking and I couldn't catch my breath no matter how hard I tried. Mom grabbed my arm, and we turned around and went straight back to the car. She didn't say anything the whole drive home, but I could see her hands shaking on the steering wheel. That afternoon, the detective called while I was doing homework, and Mom put her on speaker. She said the state lab finished testing the collar and found traces of the same sedatives that were in those eye drop bottles. The drugs were all over the collar, which meant the man had been handling them right before he would have given me that drugged cookie. Mom asked if this was good for the case, and the detective said it was huge because it proved intent, showing he was ready to drug me the second I took the bait. The detective said she'd send over the official lab report for Carson to use in court. Saturday morning, someone knocked on our door, and when Mom opened it, there was this woman with a kid about my age standing behind her. The woman said she was Kai's mom and asked if they could come in for a few minutes. Mom brought them to the living room and made coffee while Kai and I just looked at each other not knowing what to say. His mom suggested we go to my room to talk while the adults stayed in the kitchen. Kai followed me upstairs and we sat on my bed for like 5 minutes before either of us said anything. He told me about waking up in the woods with his wrists all messed up and not remembering anything after eating that cookie. I told him about finding the collar in my pocket and how I didn't even know the man put it there. We compared what the man said to each of us, and it was almost word for word the same sob story about poor Buddy being lost. Kai suddenly said the name Buddy was genius because everyone wants to help find a lost dog, especially one with such a friendly name. He figured the creep probably stood in front of a mirror practicing his crying and his whole sad act until it was perfect. We talked for another hour about how this whole thing messed with our heads, and it actually helped knowing someone else got what I was going through. Carson called that night right after dinner, and his voice sounded worried. He said the defense attorney filed some motion saying the way the cops identified the man was messed up, and they wanted all the identification thrown out. Carson explained this was normal defense lawyer stuff, trying to poke holes in everything, but it still made me feel sick, thinking the man might get away with this. He said not to worry because the judge would probably deny the motion, but we needed to be ready for anything. 2 days later, the detective called again with more lab results. The analyst tested the actual liquid in those eye drop bottles and found enough sedatives to knock out a grown man. She said just a few drops on a cookie would have had me unconscious in minutes, and I wouldn't have woken up for hours. Mom asked how the man even got that stuff, and the detective said they were still investigating, but it looked like he'd been collecting it for a long time. Carson called the next week and said I needed to come to his office to practice testifying. Mom drove me there after school, and Carson had set up the conference room to look like a courtroom with chairs arranged in rows. He stood at a podium and asked me the same questions over and over about what happened at the market. First, I told him about talking to the man, and then about Kai grabbing me, and then about finding the collar. He kept stopping me and making me start over, saying I needed to be super clear about the timeline. I messed up twice, mixing up whether the man reached for his pocket before or after I offered to help look for his dog. Carson said it was okay, and that's why we were practicing, but I felt stupid for not remembering every single detail perfectly. Monday at the school, I was walking to lunch when some kid from my math class said something about me getting beat up by a little kid in a Boy Scout uniform. Before I could even think of what to say back, our teacher came out of nowhere and told the kid to go to the office right now. The teacher looked at me and said, if anyone else gave me trouble about what happened, I should tell her immediately. 3 days later, I was sitting in the kitchen doing homework when I heard Mom on the phone in the living room talking to Grandma about taking more time off work. She kept her voice low, but I could still hear her say she'd already used most of her vacation days for all my appointments and didn't know how she'd cover the bills if she had to take unpaid leave. My chest got tight hearing that because I knew this whole mess was eating up her savings and making everything harder for us. The detective called that afternoon while Mom was at the grocery store and mentioned something that made my skin crawl. The man had been coaching youth basketball at the rec center for 15 years without a single complaint, and parents were freaking out because their kids had been alone with him hundreds of times. She said they were contacting every family whose kid had been on his teams, but so far, nobody had reported anything suspicious, which somehow made it worse, because it meant he'd been hiding in plain sight all that time. 2 days after that, I was back in therapy with Adeline working through the market incident for the third time when something weird happened. I was describing how the man had been crying about his dog, when I suddenly felt this pressure on my left shoulder, like someone was standing right behind me, even though nobody was there. My whole body tensed up, and Adeline noticed right away, explaining that body memories are super common with trauma, and sometimes your body remembers stuff your brain blocked out. She had me close my eyes and focus on the feeling which made me realize the man had actually touched my shoulder when he was talking to me, but I'd forgotten about it completely. That night, Kai sent me a bunch of photos on his phone, and at first I didn't want to look, but then I opened them. The pictures showed his wrists from 3 weeks ago with these deep rope burns that went all the way around, like he'd been tied up for hours. The marks were mostly healed now, but you could still see the scars clearly, and it made me so mad thinking about what that creep did to him. I texted back that we were going to make sure he paid for everything, and Kai just sent back a thumbs up emoji. Carson called the next morning with good news that the judge had signed a protective order keeping the man away from all farmers markets, schools, parks, and anywhere else kids might be. Mom showed me some comments online where people were complaining about violating his rights and saying he hadn't been convicted yet, but I didn't care what random strangers thought when I knew what he'd tried to do. The school announced a community safety meeting for that Thursday night, and Mom dragged me along even though I really didn't want to go. The gym was packed with parents, and when they opened the floor for comments, Mom stood up and said we needed better security at public events, like metal detectors and more cameras. About half the crowd started clapping while the other half looked at her like she was being dramatic, and one dad actually said out loud that we couldn't live in fear. Mom sat down with her face all red, but she squeezed my hand and I squeezed back because I was proud of her for speaking up. Carson had warned us the preliminary hearing would be rough, but I wasn't ready for how scary the courthouse would feel. We got there early and had to wait in this hallway outside the courtroom with a bunch of other people, and my hands were sweating so bad I kept wiping them on my jeans. Every time someone walked by in a suit, I wondered if they were with the defense, and every noise made me jump. After what felt like forever, they called us in, and everything got super formal and serious. The clerk stood up and announced the case number in this loud voice, while the judge sat behind this huge wooden desk, looking down at everyone. The judge had this calm, steady voice that somehow made everything feel more real and official. Then I saw him sitting at the defense table in a nice suit, with his hair all combed, looking nothing like the crying mess from the farmer's market. He didn't even look at me, but I couldn't stop staring at him, wondering how someone could pretend to be so normal when they were actually a monster. When it was my turn to testify, Carson had me describe everything step by step, starting with the man crying about his dog. I focused on explaining how his hand went to his pocket while we were talking, and how I found the collar later without remembering him giving it to me. Carson brought out the evidence bag with the red collar inside and had me point out the tag that said Buddy, which I did, even though seeing it again made my hands shake. The defense lawyer stood up and started asking about the Boy Scout incident, trying to make it sound like I'd attacked an innocent kid for no reason. I stayed as calm as I could and explained I was just trying to help find a lost dog when Kai saved my life by recognizing what was really happening. The lawyer kept pushing, asking if I often got violent with younger kids and if I had anger issues, but Carson objected, and the judge told the lawyer to move on. When I finally got to step down, my legs felt like jelly, and Mom grabbed my arm to steady me as we walked back to our seats. The lab analyst took the stand next and started pulling out these charts, showing all the test results from the eye drops. She pointed to different numbers on her paper and explained that the amount of sedatives in those bottles was crazy high. One drop would knock out a grown man, and the cookies he made had way more than that. She said someone my size would have been unconscious in minutes and could have stopped breathing completely. The judge was writing like crazy in his notebook and kept asking her to repeat certain parts about the dosage amounts. Mom's hand found mine again when the analyst said the word fatal, and I felt her whole body tense up. After she finished explaining all the science stuff, Kai got called up to testify, and my stomach twisted seeing him walk to the front. He looked smaller up there in his Boy Scout uniform, and his voice was really quiet when he started talking. Carson asked him simple questions about recognizing the man's behavior pattern from his own experience 3 weeks earlier. Kai didn't have to go into all the bad stuff that happened to him, which I was glad about. He just explained how he saw the man's hand going to his pocket and knew what was about to happen. When Carson finished, Kai looked right at me before walking back to his seat, and I gave him a small nod. He nodded back, and I saw his mom put her arm around him when he sat down. The defense lawyer tried to ask Kai more questions, but the judge shut it down, saying the boy had been through enough. After all the testimony was done, the judge took a break to review everything before making his decision. We waited in the hallway for what felt like forever before they called us back in. The judge said there was more than enough evidence to move forward with a full trial and set the bail super high with strict conditions. The man would have to wear an ankle monitor and stay away from all public places where kids might be. Carson met us outside the courtroom and said this was actually a really good outcome because the judge could have set lower bail. That night I was doing homework when Mom got a call from the detective warning us that someone had posted our address online. Mom ran to the front window, and there were already 3 news vans parked outside with reporters setting up cameras on our lawn. She called the cops, but they said the reporters weren't technically doing anything illegal by being on the sidewalk. We packed bags and drove to my aunt's house an hour away, where we stayed for 2 days. The police finally got the reporters to leave by increasing patrols in our neighborhood every 30 minutes. When we got back home, there were still people driving by, slowly trying to get pictures of our house. My first appointment with Adeline after the hearing was rough, because I kept jumping at every sound in her office. She had me write down all the things that made me panic now, like crying men, or the smell of medicine, or when people reached into their pockets suddenly. We spent the whole session working on breathing exercises and grounding techniques for each trigger on my list. She taught me this thing where I count 5 things I can see, 4 I can hear, 3 I can touch, 2 I can smell, and 1 I can taste. It actually helped when I practiced it, but I still felt stupid doing it in front of her. Carson called Mom the next day to explain what would happen next with the legal stuff. He said if we went to trial and won, the man could get 20 years in prison, but there was always a chance he could get off completely. A plea deal would guarantee at least 10 years, but Mom wanted him to get the maximum time possible. I just wanted everything to be over, so I could stop thinking about it every single day. Carson said we had time to decide, and would meet again in a week to discuss it more. 2 days later, the detective called with news that made my skin crawl. 3 more families had contacted the tip line after seeing the news coverage about suspicious encounters at farmers markets over the past year. All of them had similar stories about a crying man looking for his dog named Buddy. She actually apologized for how the cops treated me at first, explaining they had to maintain their sting operation. They couldn't blow Kai's cover or let the man know they were watching him. It still made me mad, but at least I understood why they acted like I was the bad guy. School was getting harder to deal with because I couldn't focus on anything the teachers were saying. My mind would drift to the courtroom or the man's face or wondering how many other kids he tried to hurt. The principal called me to her office and offered to let me do half days with independent study for the rest of the semester. I could come for morning classes and then work from home in the afternoons, which sounded perfect. Mom had to sign a bunch of paperwork, but she agreed it was better than me failing because I couldn't concentrate. Whitney Solis wrote this big article in the paper about security problems at farmers markets, but she didn't use my name. She interviewed a bunch of vendors who all said they needed more cameras and maybe even security guards walking around. The article actually led to some good changes with the market organizers adding new safety rules. Mom showed me the article and said at least something positive was coming from all this mess. That weekend, Mom and I got into our first real fight since everything happened. I wanted to walk to Tyler's house, which was only 3 blocks away, but she insisted on driving me. We went back and forth for 20 minutes with her saying it wasn't safe and me saying I couldn't live in a bubble forever. Finally, we compromised that I could walk there if I texted her the second I arrived, and again when I was leaving to come home. 3 days later, Mom dragged me to the school cafeteria, where about 40 parents were setting up folding chairs in a big circle. The room smelled like old pizza and floor cleaner. A woman with a clipboard was passing out bright yellow vests that said, "Market Safety Volunteer" across the back. Mom grabbed 2 seats near the exit, while I texted Tyler that I'd be stuck here for at least an hour. The meeting organizer started explaining how they'd have volunteers walking in pairs through the farmers market every Saturday and Sunday. She showed us a map with different zones marked in red ink and assigned each pair specific areas to patrol. Parents kept raising their hands, asking about walkie-talkies and emergency procedures and whether they should approach suspicious people or just call the cops. Mom signed us up for the 8 to 10 morning shift, which meant getting up super early on weekends, but at least we'd be done before lunch. The organizer handed out laminated cards with warning signs to watch for and phone numbers for market security and local police. Seeing all these adults taking action because of what almost happened to me made my chest feel tight, but also kind of proud. Carson called Mom's cell during dinner the next night, and she put him on speaker while we ate leftover Chinese food. The state lab had finished testing everything from the man's car and found cookie crumbs under the passenger seat that tested positive for the same sedatives in the eye drops. They also found a half-eaten cookie wrapped in a napkin in his glove compartment with enough drugs to knock someone out for hours. Carson said this was huge because it proved he had the drugged cookies ready to go and wasn't just carrying eye drops for allergies like his lawyer tried to claim. The forensic people matched the napkin to ones from a diner near the farmer's market, which gave them even more evidence about his planning. Mom kept nodding and taking notes on the back of a takeout menu while I pushed rice around my plate, feeling sick. 2 weeks passed before Carson called again, and this time his voice sounded different, more serious. The defense lawyer had contacted him about a possible plea deal where the man would plead guilty to all charges in exchange for 12 years in prison. He'd have to register as a sex offender for life and couldn't go near schools or parks or anywhere kids gathered even after he got out. Carson explained that if we went to trial and won, the man could get up to 20 years. But there was always a chance the jury might not convict or might give him less time. Mom wanted to fight for the maximum sentence, but Carson said 12 years guaranteed was better than risking a trial where anything could happen. He gave us a week to think about it and said he'd set up a call with the other families to discuss it together. That Friday afternoon, we sat around Mom's laptop waiting for the video call to start. Kai's family connected first, and his mom looked tired with dark circles under her eyes. Then 2 other families joined, both with kids around my age who looked as uncomfortable as I felt. Everyone introduced themselves, and then Carson explained the plea deal again, going through all the details about prison time and registration and supervised probation. Kai's mom spoke first, saying she just wanted it over, so Kai could move on without having to testify at trial. One of the other moms agreed, saying her daughter was already having nightmares about having to see him in court again. The other family wanted more time in prison, but understood the risk of going to trial. After an hour of talking, everyone agreed that 12 years guaranteed was better than gambling on a jury. Carson said he'd tell the defense lawyer we accepted the deal and would schedule the plea hearing for next month. Adeline met with me twice that week to work on my victim impact statement for the hearing. She had me write down everything I wanted the judge to know about how this affected my life. My first draft was 3 pages of rambling about nightmares and being scared of strangers and not trusting people anymore. She helped me cut it down to 1 page that focused on the specific ways he'd changed my daily life. We practiced reading it out loud over and over because I kept crying at the part about checking my pockets constantly to make sure nothing was planted there. She taught me to pause and breathe when I felt tears coming and to look at Mom in the courtroom instead of at him if I needed strength. By our 4th practice session, I could get through the whole thing without completely breaking down, though my voice still shook at certain parts. Saturday morning, Mom surprised me by driving to the farmer's market parking lot. My whole body tensed up, and I grabbed the door handle ready to refuse to get out. She promised we'd stay together the whole time, and could leave the second I felt uncomfortable. We walked through the entrance where the new security guard checked our bags and nodded at Mom's volunteer vest. The smells hit me first, fresh bread and flowers and that weird mix of vegetables and dirt. My legs felt shaky, but I kept walking, staying so close to Mom that I kept bumping into her. I texted Tyler constantly, sending him pictures of every booth we passed like proof I was actually doing this. We made it through the whole market in 20 minutes, not stopping to buy anything, just walking the circuit to prove I could. Mom squeezed my hand when we got back to the car, and I realized I'd been holding my breath for most of the walk. The morning of the plea hearing, my hands were sweating, so bad I had to keep wiping them on my dress pants. The courthouse was packed with reporters and security guards and families from the case. We had to go through metal detectors and wait in a special room until they called us in. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with dark wood everywhere and those uncomfortable bench seats. The man came in wearing an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs, looking nothing like the crying person from the farmer's market. When it was my turn to read my statement, I walked to the podium on shaky legs. My voice cracked on the first sentence, but I kept going, looking right at him while I described the sleepless nights and panic attacks, and how I couldn't help anyone anymore because I was too scared. I talked about Kai and the other kids, and how we'd all carry this forever because of what he did. When I finished and sat back down, Mom grabbed my hand and held it tight. The judge listened to everyone's statements and then accepted the plea deal, sentencing him to 12 years with no chance of early release. She added lifetime registration and 20 years of probation after his release with strict conditions about staying away from children. Kai's mom hugged my mom, and they both started crying while the bailiffs led the man away. Carson shook everyone's hands and said we'd done the right thing accepting the deal. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions, but we walked straight to the car without stopping. Monday at the school felt weird after everything that happened at court. During lunch, the kid who'd made fun of me weeks ago came up to my table looking uncomfortable. He mumbled that his parents made him read all the news articles about the case, and he was sorry for being such a jerk about it. I just nodded because what else was there to say? Teachers kept checking on me between classes, asking if I needed anything or wanted to talk. The detective called that afternoon, asking if I'd help review a new safety handout they were creating for teenagers. She wanted someone who'd actually experienced this stuff to make sure the information was useful and not just generic warnings. I agreed, because maybe it would help some kid avoid what almost happened to me. 2 weeks passed, and Adeline moved our sessions to once a week since the nightmares had mostly stopped, and I wasn't waking up in cold sweats anymore. I still caught myself checking my pockets every time I walked past strangers, patting them down like I was looking for something that shouldn't be there, but at least the full-blown panic attacks where I couldn't breathe had faded to maybe once every couple weeks. Mom noticed the improvement too, and one Saturday morning she handed me my bike helmet and told me I could ride to the corner store by myself as long as I was back in 15 minutes, and texted her when I got there. The ride took 3 minutes, but those 3 minutes of pedaling alone down our street felt huge, like getting a piece of my old life back, even though I checked behind me at every driveway and my hands were shaking on the handlebars. Carson's letter came in the mail that Tuesday with the official seal and everything, thanking us for our cooperation and confirming the case was closed now that the man was locked up. Mom took it straight to the craft store and bought this fancy frame for it, hanging it in the hallway next to my school photos, which seemed weird, but I got why she needed something official to look at, something that proved it was really over. The lab analyst who'd testified called the school and worked with them to create this whole presentation about evidence and how drugs work, using simplified versions of the actual test results from my case without naming me specifically. Sitting in the assembly watching her explain how the sedatives would have knocked me out within minutes and seeing the actual science laid out on the big screen made it sink in just how close I'd come to ending up like Kai, or worse. Whitney Solis published her follow-up article in the Sunday paper with a big photo of the farmers market's new security booth and quotes from the detective about how the community had stepped up to protect kids. She didn't use my name but mentioned the brave young victim whose quick thinking helped catch a predator, which Mom cut out and added to her growing collection of newspaper clippings in a folder she thought I didn't know about. That Friday, Kai's mom dropped him off at the arcade, and we spent 3 hours just being normal kids, playing racing games, and that shooting game with the plastic rifles, eating greasy pizza, and drinking too much soda without talking about any of the heavy stuff that connected us. We didn't need to talk about it, because we both knew what the other had been through, and sometimes that's enough. Just being around someone who gets it without having to explain anything. The detective called the next week saying I needed to come sign one last form, acknowledging that the collar would stay in evidence storage permanently as part of the closed case file. Standing in that sterile evidence room looking at the sealed bag with that red collar inside, knowing it would sit in some box forever, actually made me feel better, like that piece of the whole mess would be locked away where it belonged. 3 months had passed since that day at the market, and yeah, I still jumped. When strangers got too close at the store or crossed the street, when I saw older men walking alone, and I knew I'd never be the kid who'd help someone look for their lost dog again. But my grades were back up to B's, and I'd rejoined the basketball team, and could sleep through the night without waking up scared, and the detective had told us he'd gotten 12 years, which meant I'd be 26 before he could even think about getting out. Mom still drove me places more than she used to, and Adeline said the pocket-checking thing might never fully go away, but I had friends who knew what happened, and didn't treat me different. Had adults who believed me and fought for me. And most importantly, I'd learned that surviving something terrible doesn't mean you're broken forever. It just means you're different from you were before. All right, thanks for hanging out and wondering through all these questions with me today. Kinda wild journey, right? Anyway, I'll catch you next time. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.